Hi everyone. Today I'm here interviewing Omar Najmi, a composer and Grammy-nominated tenor whose evocative song cycle, My Name is Alondra, is featured in my concert program, Through My Eyes, Sounds of the Americas. Omar's work melds personal storytelling with rich musical expression, inviting listeners into a vibrant emotional narrative. Hi Omar, how are you?
Hi, Fanny. I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm so glad you're here to talk about My Name is Alondra. Can you tell me what inspired you to compose this piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So this piece was actually commissioned by the Boston Lyric Opera during the pandemic in 2020. And it was a collaboration between Boston Lyric Opera and the city of Boston, where Alondra, who wrote the poetry, was at the time the youth poet laureate of the city of Boston. So they wanted to do this partnership where they would pair up the youth poet laureate with an emerging composer at Boston Lyric Opera, which was me at the time. So that's sort of how we got this process started. And through that sort of genesis of this partnership, uh, Alondra and I met over Zoom, as everything happened in those days.
Yeah.
Um, and we had basically decided they weren't the project wasn't commissioning new poetry from her, so we were looking at her existing works and trying to find some things that would work with being set to music. So she basically, we met, talked, got a sense of each other's style. I had already, looked her up and seen, amazing videos of her performing, reading her own work. And she basically shared with me, whole like Google Doc of like a bunch of stuff she had selected from her works that she thought might be uh, good possible options for being set to music. So I looked through all these pieces. We were looking. I think we were looking for like approximately 20 to 25 minutes of music. So there were some sort of constraints and parameters. And I basically went through and picked out like, here are the things that are really speaking to me. There were about like 7 poems when we first combed through that I really loved, and we had to whittle down so we could be within the you know
Um,
required time frame. There was just like there was so much great material. There was some of it that I really would have also loved to set, but basically as we winnowed this down, I started focusing in on what kind of a narrative we were wanting to tell through this song cycle, because I was hoping that rather than just being a collection of songs that are all settings of poetry by this one poet, that there would be something that also felt like it had a more cohesive narrative. Um, and the starting point for me was the opening poem of this song cycle, which is this sort of tongue in cheek, tell me about yourself, like almost the way you would like in the forum you would put on like a dating profile or something. Here's everything about me, but she has this, I don't know, like amazing way of like it's humorous in places, but it's also there's so much depth to it. There's like a wisdom beyond her years, and I feel like from that poem, the commonality that I saw between that and her work more broadly is this emphasis on the personal, that she is so sort of raw and honest
mhm.
about her interiority and like opening that up to the world and sharing that. And that's something that's, I think, is very brave. It's very impressive to me, and it's something that I think allows a kind of artistic narrative that lets us into a human mind in a much more real way than we get in like, I don't know, in older poetry, which is, a lot of the songs that we sing as classical singers are settings of romantic poetry that's like a little bit more heightened, and this felt so real. So that led me into choosing 4 poems, starting with this one that all focused in some way on really on her as a person, and on like the journey of her inner life, some of her struggles as well as her joys. And I wanted to build these. So I think one of the things that you noticed while you were working on these pieces, because they're all sort of date and time stamped based on when she wrote them.
And that's what's interesting, that it's not like a title, like this song is about springtime or
Yeah, right, right.
like a
But
date
that but
and
that the order, I think they're in like they're not in chronological order. They're actually like kind of in reverse. But really, the order that I put them in, I was just looking for creating a narrative that started with this introduction, went into some of the deeper places, but that would end with this leaning towards the light, coming towards a sense of healing.
Yeah, a true hero's journey, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think anything in art form in this realm that has a hero's journey is very appealing to the human experience. And I think you definitely capture that. And how incredible that, we're talking about your work as a composer of the music of the poetry of Alondra Bobadilla, who I just want to make sure that our viewers know that Alondra is a Dominican-American poet who I will be interviewing this week as well to share her background and how she got to write this amazing poetry for the song cycle that you ended up composing for. And she composed this in English because I just want to make sure that the viewers know that even though she's Dominican American, this was composed in English. At one of our concerts, actually, someone thought that she had composed everything in Spanish, and I wanted to make that clear. But the value of just having someone's work who's so young. Because do you know how old she was when she wrote this poetry? Um,
I don't know her age, but when I was first connected with her, she was a senior in high school. So that sort of gives you
exactly.
a
Wow.
framework. And she had already written some of these. So, they weren't even necessarily like immediately recent. So, yeah, she was quite young. It's
Yeah.
extremely impressive work.
Yeah, so impressive, and also how amazing that it could be partner with an emerging composer, which was you at this time, now seasoned composer,
Yeah,
um, and that someone's perspective, who's so young, can be shared with the world, and now will live through time, you know.
totally.
It's really moving. Thanks for sharing that. And so, how do you think this composition fits into your broader artistic journey and musical style?
So I'm thinking about where this fell in my compositional journey. I'm just gonna like tangent for a minute and say that I kind of had an interesting journey into composition, which is that I didn't start as a composer. I trained as a singer and still sing professionally, and that's a huge part of my career. And it wasn't until 2017 that I started writing my first opera on a whim, and that led me into this journey in composition. And in 2019, I had completed my first opera, and it was and produced a performance of it, which I had invited the folks I worked for at Boston Lyric Opera to come see, and that's what ultimately led to them bringing me on as an emerging composer. So my name is Alondra is actually fairly early in my compositional work. I think I had written my first opera, and I had written maybe a couple other songs, but this was again fairly early on in me finding my style. Um,
Which was very impressive. La Ardiente Oscuridad was
yeah,
really
thank you.
impressive. I was there, and of course, viewers, you don't know this yet, but Omar and I went to school together. And that's how our connection begins. But that was really a magnificent work. And for me, as a Spanish speaker, it spoke to me. And I was happy to see a new work that really took into account this cultural and linguistic um, realm that is not very explored, at least in the classical stage. So I feel that was a wonderful way to start. Good
Oh,
for
thank
you.
you. Thank you. But yeah, for this piece in sort of like my compositional trajectory, I something I always think about, which I don't exactly do deliberately, but it's sort of I feel like as a composer develops, each individual piece wants to have its own individual feel, but also
Mhm.
eventually you sort of realize like, there are some hallmarks of my own style that become a through line through my compositions. But I always try to be really guided by the text. So
Mhm.
my first opera, En la Ardiente Oscuridad,
Mhm.
it was a very dark opera. It was a setting. It's even there in the title. But it was a setting of a play that was written under Franco's regime in Spain, and so the music of it was very sort of turbulent. And with this poetry for My Name Is Alondra, I wanted to explore some other angles of what I was capable of. And yes, there are moments in this cycle that are very serious also, but then there are moments of it that are so joyful. And particularly in the opening number, I wanted to find a language that was original, new, but fundamentally accessible. And I feel like this piece represented, there are moments in it that are my sort of the first examples of me exploring some. I mean, it's a classical song cycle, but there are some, quasi jazzy elements of it. There are some things that feel a little crossovery, and that just, I don't know, that felt right for the feel and vibe of this text.
That's completely right, because as a performer of this work, I feel like you really capture with those more musical theater vibes and jazzy areas her youth and
Hmm.
her expression that goes beyond just a very boxy classical expectation that some people may have.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think particularly, like there's a moment in the first number where she's talking about like how she loves watching rom-coms but always cries, and like how sort of openly emotional she is. And I just like, there's something so, I don't know, just so charming about her language that I really wanted to capture that in sort of like a like upbeat and like bubbly nature to the music.
I think you did. And I can't wait for people to actually experience this, because we have a run of three concerts pretty much back to back in separated by 2 weeks. So I'm very excited for the Boston area audience to get to know this piece.
Yeah,
We've
me too.
already gotten comments like, oh my God, thank you for performing this refreshing music. That's how people are referring to your work. And I think
That's
that
what I love to hear.
yeah. So that takes me to, a question that I was going to ask later, but I'm going to ask it now because I think it's important. How do you see this music resonating with today's audiences, and what do you hope listeners take away from it?
That's a good question. You know, when I write music, I don't know if I think about it exactly that way. I
How do
think,
you think about it?
yeah, no, I think what the angle that I approach from when I'm writing is to look at this text, really immerse myself in the text, and see what can how can my music serve to bring this text to the surface, that I see myself as a servant to the poetry in a sense. And I think what I believe in terms of like the resonance of a piece with today's audience, I guess where I live is that if I write with integrity and I am really a servant to the poetry rather than trying to make myself the principal character as the composer. Do you know what I mean? If I'm really here to serve bringing the most I can out of this poetry, then I think the integrity of that artistic product will reach people and will resonate with people. I know that's a little bit of a cop out of an answer, but
It's
think
not.
I
It's
think
not.
my focus is on making this and really being true to this text. And I think when, as an audience, when we hear a conflict between those two things, when we hear a composer who's trying to insist their own voice onto a piece of text or vice versa, I think we read a sense of dissonance there, and it pulls us out of it. And I
Mhm.
think that, you know like trusting in the power of Alondra's words, I think if I really lean into that and let my music bring that out, I really truly believe that will speak to people. And I guess at the root of this is also, my answer. I would pass off to the poetry and say I think what I hope will resonate for people and what they will take away really comes from the words. And it's a window into what it is like being. I don't want to sound like I'm reducing Alondra's work to her age, but being a young person in 2020, when we started working on this together, and in this era, I think it's hard for people, even people like myself growing up in the 90s in a very different world to really understand what it's like to grow up in this world now and how different that is and what that does to our interior life. But also, like, I am so impressed by Gen Z, by the amount of like inner work and self-actualization that young people have today, and that's something that I see in her poetry so much. So that's
Yeah.
something that I think will resonate and that I hope people will take away from it.
Yeah, I think you were saying that it's almost not answering the question, but I think you are in a way that is more philosophical even, because I think finding integrity in our work nowadays is very hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard because there are pressures of being the next best thing and how to one up the next thing. And sometimes people exchange their integrity for being the hottest thing out there. And I think I know you as a person, but when I hear your music, when I study your music, I also feel that that's coming through, that you're not settling for just being the next best thing, but truly serving the text. And I think, if we extrapolate that to people that are not even in the music business, in anything that we do, if you can bring your integrity, that makes everything just better, more organic, and worth the time of the people. Because when audiences come to see something, we want their time to be spent well. Um,
Absolutely. And something that now I'm thinking about this question you asked, something that I would add too is just that one of my biggest hopes, not just about this piece, but about my music in general,
Mhm.
I always hold as a personal barometer. I've been living and breathing like music for my whole life and
Mhm.
classical music for the, last, you know, 15 years of my professional life.
Mhm.
It is so important to me with everything that I write that if someone comes in with zero past experience of classical song in this example, that they would still be able to appreciate this music, that I'm writing in a way that they would still have plenty to take away from it, and that it doesn't require sort of inside knowledge to get
Yeah.
around the material.
Basically meet them where they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Um, were there any particular challenges or discoveries you encounter when writing this piece?
Yeah, totally. It was actually one of the most interesting and challenging compositional processes I've worked on. And this is for sort of one or two big reasons. And they both have to do with the style of Alondra's poetry. So one of the things that I thought was an amazing opportunity and also a challenge is that she performs her own work. And the first introduction I had to her when I was approached by BLO about this collaboration. So I immediately looked her up, wanted to get a sense of her and her work. And I found videos of her giving performances, giving readings of her own poetry. And when you hear a poet like her read their own poetry, and she is, I will say, a very gifted performer also in how it's not just a reading of a poetry. It is a full performance when you see her. And what that meant is that in her reading of her poetry, there was already a sense of music to it, to the way she recited it. There was already a built in sort of rhythm and inflection, which in some ways is really helpful because I think one of the things that was a joy to set about her poetry is that there is music in it. But
Yeah.
it also means that it's like I have to, if it's like if I don't want to necessarily be fully influenced by her reading, but I also feel like I should be because it's, she's the creator. So I think there was just like that complexity. And it's actually part of what steered me towards some of I think for all the pieces I set in this, they were not things that I had listened to her do a recitation of. But even like within these works, it's like you can hear in the sort of rhythmic scheme of it, there's already a certain structure to it. And so it's like, what can my music contribute to that, and how do I make sure it's not in conflict with that or taking away from that? I guess that's where I would
Yeah,
put
yeah.
it. And then the biggest thing is that in her style. A couple of the, and this is also this specifically some of the poems I chose, but at least two of these poems are quite sprawling in form. They are much longer than the poems that you would typically encounter in a classical song setting. Usually, when you're looking at like 19th century German song or German classical song, for example, a lot of these songs are maybe 2 minutes long, 3 minutes long. There's settings of like a poem that's like one or two stanzas. The
Mm-hmm.
opening number of this is what, like 9 minutes long. It's really sprawling, and I loved that poem, so I really wanted to set it because I felt like there was something so fun about opening this number with this like, here I am, here are all these facets of who I am. But what that poem meant is that there are all these different sections we move through, and that was a huge challenge to sort of tie that together into a cohesive
Cohesive,
piece.
yes.
And it's form wise, it's unlike anything I've written, probably unlike anything I'll write again. I'm really proud of what the end result was, but it almost feels like it's a bunch of songs in one, that you have all these different sections, but they're linked together by this motif that I open the whole cycle with, and that comes back in, I think it comes back, yeah, it comes back in every number.
It
In every
does.
one of the four numbers, this motif comes back and sort of ties it together.
And can you just define or even make the sound of the motif so that someone who maybe is not classically trained knows what it means?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a motif in music is just a small musical idea, a piece of a melody that is used and reused. And in this song cycle, I open the whole thing before a note is sung by the singer. In the piano, we have this da 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 da, but particularly just that little da 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 da. That little figure comes back throughout. I don't know where that came from in my mind. I'm like, I was trying to think, was it usually my motifs are influenced by text somewhere like the that I said, but this I don't. I think this was more. It was more about a feeling. It was more about a feeling that I wanted to capture, and it comes
Which is
back in
so
all sorts of different
important.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah, people often wonder, like, oh my God, what does that composer think about? How do they bring all the ideas? And that's exactly it. There's intuition and there's
Yep.
sensation that we often don't talk about, but it's like the root of finding your voice in music and whether you sing it or you compose it. And I'm so glad you brought that up. Awesome, thank you. And our final question for the day is, if you could describe this piece in 3 words, what would they be and why?
All right. Let me think about this for a sec. If I could describe this piece in just 3 words, I think they would be personal, honest, and healing. I
Wow.
think the reason why I start with personal because I feel like it's sort of a concretely the foundational element of this piece is that it it looks inward to give outward. There is something about like looking into the self as a way to interact and share with the world. And then I say honest because I think what strikes me so much about this poetry, and particularly the poems that we selected for this song cycle, is that Alondra is incredibly vulnerable in exposing every part of her interiority. And I think there's, particularly I think about the third song where she talks openly about her anxieties and even her, OCD tendencies, and how these things are a continuing struggle for her. And I think there's something about just being completely open about like where you are that is, again, when you share that with the world, it gives people permission to forgive themselves for things that they have that they struggle with, to say we are all humans. And even this amazing artist who is writing this poetry is also going through things that I'm going through, and it makes you feel seen. I think there's something so human about it. I guess there's my fourth adjective. I'd say human,
Yeah.
but I wanted to include healing in there also because this, like I said earlier on, about like how we ordered these poems and
Which there
set them
are
into,
4 songs in
yeah.
this cycle, just want to.
Um, it I wanted it to feel like even if it goes to some darker places, that it bends towards the light. And even in the third song, which I would say is like the darkest one, even at the end of that, there's this like we're not all the way there yet, but it feels like we're moving towards a sense of healing, and particularly the grounding that she finds in it through her faith, which I think is also a sort of a foundational element of her poetry.
That's beautiful. I think also as you were speaking, it dawned on me like this word validating, very validating.
Absolutely.
Whereas before, youth and being in the teenage years could be seen as an emotional desert because no one knows how to talk to you about it. If you are the teen or the parent, it's just uncomfortable. But this piece really captures that validation of you are feeling things and it's okay. And there's a container, and your music acts as that container. Um, oh my God, Omar, thank you so much for your time, for your
Thank
music,
you.
sharing in so many forms, the gift that you bring to the world, and please keep doing it.
Thank you.
Take care.
It's been such a pleasure to chat with you, and I can't wait to see your performance.
Yay. Okay, stay tuned for Through My Eyes, Sounds of the Americas. And I'll put the calendar up next. Bye-bye.
Bye.